Hello everyone, and welcome to another Bottled Sky devlog. Last month, we prepared the game to be ready to present at the Creative Coast Festival. This month, we took feedback into consideration and made an improved demo to present at the Nordic Games Conference. I'll talk about some of the improvements made and various other features that were worked on through the month of May. The most obvious change at a glance is that I have created a new background for the game. This was always planned because the shader I was previously using for the background wasn't mine. It was just a placeholder, and it didn't really match the art style that was being built for the foreground game elements. I took inspiration from the spacey spray paint street art aesthetic and ended up with this result you're seeing now. So far, this is all done with shaders, and it goes on forever because it's just utilizing formulas. I've taken special care to avoid any obvious tiling, which was one of my complaints about the placeholder shader I was using before. The parallax isn't as strong as the previous background, but I'm hoping to add a variety of hand-drawn assets that randomly appear in the background. These assets will appear to be closer than the starry nebula layers, and will therefore have more movement in relation to more distant layers. I already have a system for displaying these hand-drawn assets, but it needs more work before I'm ready to show it off. Maybe it will be ready in the next devlog. In the last video, I mentioned various points of feedback that we got from players. One of those points was that the dialogue conversations were too long, so those have been rewritten to be much shorter. It's still very much placeholder dialogue for now, but it was a necessary change to ensure we aren't annoying players right off the bat. Another problem with the CCF build was that there was no way for the demo to reset between each player. I wanted to have a reset feature before, but there were too many errors that were triggered by reloading the space scene. However, I managed to get the reset feature working in time for the Nordic Games Conference. While this probably isn't a feature that will be included in the final release of Bottled Sky, working on it was still a net positive by cutting out bugs which I was probably going to have to fix anyway. Next, in the CCF build, I initially had the boost ability locked until you crafted and used a repair kit. That has been changed so that the boost is available from the start, but you still have some missing health until you use the repair kit to restore it. Ideally, I'd like to have a cutscene before you start the game showing that you take some damage and then tell you that you need repairs. The next point, and probably one of the most important ones, was Gamepad support. Generally, Unity makes it easy to define alternative controls for actions you already have, so I was able to quickly create Gamepad support for controlling the shuttle. However, there was a bunch of extra work that needed to be done for menus, which leads me to my next few points. For visual clarity, UI buttons now highlight if you have them selected via cursor hovering or button navigation. For even more visual clarity, an arrow also points towards the currently highlighted UI button. Normally, this wouldn't be necessary, but for the demo I wanted to disable the Auto Use and Auto Craft buttons, since those menus aren't necessary to complete the demo and would mostly be a distraction. Unfortunately, when they're disabled, they can still be selected, but can't be highlighted, so the arrow helps with communicating that these are buttons, but they're not available yet. Another problem I encountered was directional input navigation. Unity has a feature that can automatically decide which input leads to which button. For simple menus, this is usually fine to rely on, but our inventory menu has a lot of elements and some of it is generated at runtime. There was a fair bit of manual tweaking and code that I needed to alter to make UI navigation more functional and intuitive than it started with. There will probably still be a UI rework at some point in the future, but for now, what we have works. Along with the gamepad support, I also included an alternative set of controller input icons. It wouldn't make much sense to just leave in the mouse and keyboard controls if I was expecting players to possibly choose to use the Xbox controller at the conference booth. I didn't go to the convention myself, and instead enlisted the help of the artist to set up the booth and gather feedback. The convention ran for multiple days from the 23rd to the 26th of May, and I only found out after it was over that only the controller was available to use. Apparently, it's unprofessional to have multiple input options in your booth. I would have thought inclusivity was the best approach. I'm somewhat annoyed that no one mentioned it until it was all over, because I left in the mouse and keyboard input icons. I also consider mouse and keyboard to be the most optimal way to play this game, but luckily it sounds like most people had no issues getting through the demo using controller input. Ideally, I would like to only show input icons that match the controller you're using. I have built a system like this before that automatically changes the icons the instant you use a different input device, but I didn't have time to add that before the Nordic Games Conference started. A problem with player behavior I noticed was about how to use items. Even though I had a big pop-up that tells you to right-click inventory items to show a context menu, many players still used left-click, and some even dragged the item onto the shuttle and ended up just dropping the item. To help correct this, I've redesigned how you should interact with the inventory, and also because it was a necessary change to make a gamepad more intuitive to use. I first had to understand why I had it this way in the first place, and that inspiration stems from other games with inventory management like Minecraft. In those games, left-click is mainly used to move items around your inventory to let you organize it how you prefer it. However, in games like Minecraft, you usually don't use items from this menu. Instead, they're used outside of this menu via hotkeys, and usually a piece of UI called a hotbar shows you the items you have assigned to certain inputs. In an older version of Bottled Sky, I even had a hotbar. However, at some point I decided that this design was inconvenient and outdated. I've never understood how some games today, such as MMORPGs, still expect you to reach the 0 key with your left hand when it was comfortably resting around WASD. I think the only reason it is seen as intuitive is because of how long it has been in use, rather than being because it's a comfortable control scheme. That led me to take inspiration from other games like Pokemon, where you use items directly from a dedicated inventory menu. What I am now left with is confusion between what the inventory menu is supposed to do. Are you supposed to organize your inventory, or is it where you use items? Are you supposed to organize your inventory, or is this where you use items? I figured I could have both, and that isn't out of the question. But it wasn't until after playtesting did I realize that I hadn't done it in a way that was intuitive for other players, even though that is how most people interact with computers. You can left-click and drag to move around your files, and right-click opens a context menu. Maybe what I was really missing was a double-click action to use items. Although double-clicking isn't a common kind of control I've seen in games. It's something I need to give more thought to when I redesign the UI in future. But for now, as a temporary solution, I have changed the context menu to appear on left-click, while still being able to organize items by dragging the item with left-click. Right-click was entirely removed, and similarly for Gamepad, only one input is used to interact with items. Another point of feedback from players is that the hamster enemy is a confusing and difficult encounter. Currently, this is our only combat encounter, and I didn't have time to design and implement a new one that was more appropriate for a beginner's experience. I think I talked about this in more detail in the previous devlog, but to summarize, the main problems with the encounter were the following. After drilling the hamster for a few seconds, it knocks you away and damages you. Since this is your only method of dealing damage, it feels like you're being punished when really you're playing correctly. When the hamster drops below 50% health, it starts running away. I didn't communicate very well that this actually meant you were successful in driving away a hostile threat. Instead, many players were just left wondering why they can't find the enemy anymore. This isn't to say that this was bad design in general, but as a beginner, these things are very confusing if I haven't yet given you the proper tools to deal with the challenge, or the communication to understand what the challenge even was. To address this problem in time for the Nordic Games Conference, I just tweaked various numbers to make this an easier encounter more suited for a beginner. I removed the fleeing behavior by changing the threshold from 50% to a negative number so it never gets triggered. This solved the second problem. I also changed its overall health to be much smaller. Normally, when drilling, you do about 60 damage before the hamster knocks you away, but if you use your boost, then you roughly double your damage. The idea was that players would have a tougher time if they didn't try to boost, and therefore teach them that boosting does more damage if they haven't worked that out already. I felt that the encounter was now way too easy, so I experimented with having multiple enemies. Fighting 3 enemies was too difficult, but 2 hamsters were a satisfying enough challenge that could still be completed if you didn't learn about using the boost. For the demo, I ensured that even if you failed the challenge, you could choose to continue from where you left off with full health again. I probably could have done more to make this a better encounter, but I was pushed for time and this was all supposed to be temporary anyway. I'll talk more about enemy behavior designs later in the video, but for now, that pretty much wraps up all the changes made for the Nordic Games Conference demo build. At the end of the last devlog, I briefly mentioned that I created some design pillars for the game. Now that I have multiple team members to manage, it's become increasingly necessary to better communicate the vision of the game. Design pillars are essentially statements that provide direction for design decisions. They shouldn't reference specific game features, but instead communicate an experience you want to create. For example, referencing combat or conflict is a broad enough concept to reference if the game is about that, but referencing the drill is too specific and stifles potential options to explore combat via other features, even if the drill is the core mechanic currently of Bottled Sky. Whenever you're working on a feature, you should consider whether it fits with your design pillars. Later, if the game is feeling bloated and overcomplicated, then you look to the design pillars to try and trim back features until what you're left with is just features that support the core target experience. That doesn't mean design pillars can't be added, changed, or removed. It's like making a plan. You do your best to follow the plan, but you don't change it unless the plan isn't achieving its goals. Here are the design pillars of Bottled Sky in no particular order. Combat challenges the player to be aggressive or to come back when they're better equipped. With combat, I want to create a specific experience, and this is something I've talked about in much earlier devlogs. When you encounter a challenge, the player should either be ready for it or they're not. There is no in-between, meaning that if you don't know what to expect, it should be very difficult to overcome a challenge. However, this isn't about making a game that is very punishing. Failure is an intended part of the whole experience, and when you do fail, then the game should teach you everything you need to know in order to overcome the challenge on your second attempt. After that, it can be relatively easy. What this design pillar also means is that I don't want to give the player too many defensive options. You should be performing best when you're being aggressive, and being defensive is just delaying the inevitable. If you can't be aggressive, then you should be escaping. But hopefully escaping also leads you to learn about how to make a more informed second attempt. If I am to give the player any defensive options, then those options should also allow the player to be aggressive in a different way. For example, many games might offer you a shield, but using it in a timely manner might allow it to be used offensively too, often in the form of a parry. The second design pillar is exploration presents risk versus reward choices to the player. I've always been hesitant about calling Bottled Sky an open world game, because that descriptor comes with the connotation that it's about discovery and a handcrafted world with unique locations to visit. While there will be some of that naturally due to the nature of exploration, it's not an experience that we can specifically target because of how difficult it is to make in a satisfying way with the resources our small team has. Open world games also often come with the problem that you can encounter vastly more difficult content before you're ready for it. That's fine if you fully target that experience and have the resources to create that, but with our resources, we're taking a different and more manageable approach. Instead, we're treating our world like a big difficulty slider. The closer you are to the central hub, the safer and easier the content will be, and conversely, the further away you are from the central hub, the more challenging the content will be, but there are better rewards. The benefit of this approach is that players will always be aware of when they're approaching more difficult content by simply seeing that they've explored deeper than they have done so before. Another benefit is that it doesn't gate players away from difficult content if they want to challenge themselves. You just fly on past the easier content and challenge yourself with tougher enemies. The third design pillar is the player creates their own goals. This one overlaps with the previous pillar a little bit because it was about choosing your difficulty, but what this goal is more about is allowing the player to choose what kind of content they want to engage with. Open world combat is not the only content. I also plan to have other attractive options for you to interact with, such as main or side story content, traveling merchants, gathering materials, combat challenge dungeons, and more. I don't want to lock you into doing specific content. The only exception I can think of for this is maybe for pacing reasons for story content, but even then, I would want to alert and query the player beforehand so that it is always a choice. The fourth design pillar is enemies suit their environments. I might have written enemies specifically, but what I really meant is that all interactive content in the open world should work together to feel like an ecosystem. Enemies shouldn't just be traditional robots that seem like they've been standing in the same place for years just waiting to attack the player. When you first encounter some living entity, it should look like it was busy with something else before you came and disturbed it. There doesn't need to be a whole lot of variety here. Most animals are either hunting, eating, or sleeping in real life. Mainly, I want to emphasize that you, the player, are an intruder in an unfamiliar environment that existed without you well before you arrived. This mostly informs the design of enemy behavior, which is why I wrote specifically enemies, but this can also be reflected in dialogue too, with other humans you meet who have been trying to survive before you arrived. Interacting with the world and the things living in it should help you learn how to survive. The fifth and final current design pillar is the player should feel like a cool hotshot space pilot. This pillar overlaps a little bit with the first pillar in the sense that the way you do combat should look confident due to the aggressive playstyle, and the way you move should look stylish. This could even lean into the character being cocky and overconfident, which might be reflected in their dialogue and how they interact with other characters. That wraps up all the design pillars, but I've got one more thing to show off before the end of the video. Last devlog, I showed off a prototype of a potential more compact shuttle combat game. I might not be going ahead with development of that game, but it did highlight a need to really sit down and design a bunch of enemy behaviors that are more simple than the hamster's current design. The prototype contained a single enemy type, which contained just a few simple behaviors, including idle, chasing a target, attacking, and randomly wandering. Along with this, I also created a system that lets me link these behaviors in a Lego-like way without the need to rewrite code if I wanted to change how these behaviors linked together. I'm going to rebuild this system to work for Bottled Sky, but first I wanted to design a handful of simple enemies so that I could get a better grasp of what its requirements will be. I decided to do this with flowcharts. I don't think it's necessary to show them all here because it takes some time to understand and pass one of them. But this one, for example, shows the behaviors and transitions for a simple enemy that chases the player and performs a melee attack when in range. What I end up creating later might end up being slightly different after testing. What these flowcharts do is help me visualize and list what behaviors I'll need to code and what transitions I'll need to code that allows an AI to go from one behavior to the next. Anyway, that's all I have to talk about for this month. If you enjoyed watching, then like the video, and subscribe if you'd like to be notified about future videos. Join the Discord server if you want to chat with me or the community, and also to get more frequent updates about Bottled Sky's development. Thanks for watching, that's all for now, and I'll see you later.